Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, so you can get on to all of the things that are going on in your world without trying to find out the right answers. You say, well, I heard it on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. You can check in with us and join our Tuesday morning group coalition meetings on the first Tuesday of each month, virtually or in Richmond, by going to thevirginiainstitute.org and signing up there. And with great speakers, great information, a couple of emails questioning what happens next with the Virginia Education Success Accounts that we, along with the Middle Resolution, Americans for Prosperity, the Heritage Foundation, were all backing as they all kind of met the same legislative end that school choice bills have found themselves meeting in the General Assembly for years. And the answer is continue to talk to your legislators. It was a bipartisan group of legislators, Republicans and Democrats alike, who stood in the way of parents exercising choice over their students' education. School choice has to be an issue that you talk to your elected officials, whoever they may be. And with campaigns getting into full gear this weekend as sine die arrives, and the General Assembly members running for re-election will be out on the stump. And in the coming month, you'll have a lot of deadlines approaching middle of March for convention delegates, and then either a primary or convention in your district. So watch for that. And we'll get started with the program right here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our first guest with a subject that is going to at first seem strange because it's from so long ago, but I think there's some timely applications to what we're going to hear from Mark Moyar. He's a military historian at Hillsdale College and author of a book called Triumph Regained, the Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968. Mark, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for tackling a difficult subject, and a subject that I think a lot of folks would just kind of be happy with fading away into history. So maybe as we watch the Civil War get rewritten, we can rewrite the Vietnam War as well. And, what was it that prompted you to take this scholarly dive into the Vietnam War, especially this era from the very early years?
Yeah, so I started studying the Vietnam War about 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate in college, and it was then, obviously more recent, but it was already clear that it was going to be one of the most divisive controversies in U.S. history, and that it was shaping the future of politics and culture in this country. And I came to the conclusion, which has been reinforced over time, that Vietnam was distorted by opponents of the war for partisan and personal reasons, and that great injustice had been done to Vietnam veterans who I think had been wrongly been maligned by how the history had been rewritten. So I'm trying to, and there's a previous book called Triumph Forsaken that precedes this one, but in these books I've tried to show that in fact the war was not this senseless cause that we've been led to believe.
Let me pick up on something you just said there, because I know that when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were able to start getting access to some of the old KGB documents before kind of that all faded, and Vladimir Putin kind of put the Iron Curtain back up to a degree. And we learned through some of those releases that the Soviet Union, anyway, had sent an awful lot of money into the American anti-war movement. And I know that Russian collusion is a favorite expression these days, but it certainly seems like a lot of what was being fomented on college campuses can have its money traced back to Moscow.
Yes, there was a lot of money and going into the anti-war movement. We also learned, that the anti-war leaders were frequently visiting communist countries and meeting with communist leaders. And one of the perhaps most interesting things that I learned doing this was that the Soviets actually even offered to finance Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign in 1968. Now, Humphrey at least says he didn't actually take money from them, but certainly, it should remind us that foreign meddling in our elections is not a new thing, and that the Democrats haven't been pure on this issue.
Well, and you listen to some of the rhetoric that still gets sent, and I think it's important because the longer these stereotypes and these attitudes fester, the more it becomes just how history is written. And we see, now in this day and age, and I mentioned our Civil War fascination and rewriting that history, that the realities, if it's not corrected soon, as it seems to be in your book, are going to be left with this horrible look at American expansionism and American empire and all the other rhetorical things that the American left likes to throw around.
Yes, and part of why I wrote this book too, in addition to writing for veterans, is that for the country as a whole, it's critical that we know the truth about our past, because the left used Vietnam as Exhibit A in its argument that the United States is actually not the great country people have said it is. In fact, it's this terrible place that's murdering people and raping and pillaging and committing racist actions. And the truth is, as I said, very different from what they've been trying to sell us.
When you look at the real history, where did you start, Mark? I'm fascinated, given the way everything has sort of just been piled up under, Pentagon papers, he says with tongue in cheek, where did you begin to try to dig into the realities? Did you go back to our international entanglements with the French and the issues the Vietnamese had with their occupation, or Ho Chi Minh's history, studying Washington's tactics? How far did you go back?
Yeah, well, I ended up going back into ancient history. I actually started with Vietnam veterans themselves and interviewing them, because it was first from talking to them that I realized how much the written record deviated from what happened in many cases. But then, yes, ultimately I go back, and it is very important to understand the distant past, because one of the myths of Vietnam is that China and Vietnam were these mortal enemies, and we were too stupid to realize that. But in fact, China and Vietnam, for most of their history for the last 1,000 years, were usually friends, and they rarely fought with one another. And then if you go from there, that has all sorts of implications for this idea of Ho Chi Minh being some sort of nationalist who we could have appreciated, which that also is a complete falsehood.
So when we get there, and there's a lot of history that I've seen that points to a lot of the acrimony in Vietnam was really more directed at the French and their occupation, which had gone on for many, many years longer before the United States came in to help the South Vietnamese. Getting into some of that, the history of Vietnam before America got there. Do you touch on any of that? Yes, I do. Well,
in the preceding book, Triumph Forsaken, I go into the colonial experience and how it's more complicated than we're often led to believe. The French actually, they don't do everything right, but they do attract support from a lot of nationalists, and they cultivate people who support them. And during their war against the Viet Minh, they increasingly give authority to the Vietnamese nationalists. And the Vietnamese communists are very ruthless in going after a lot of anti-communist nationalists and kill off quite a few of them, which abets their cause. But, the French, they ultimately, they keep this fight going with actually a much smaller number of troops than the U.S. has, because they do hold most of the North. And that's one of the big problems the Americans confront, is that when they come in, they're only in the southern half of the country, and the military wants to go north, and Lyndon Johnson repeatedly shoots that down, and which is one of the big problems of the war.
Now, I note in in your book, especially as you lay out the frame 65 to 68, that's the beginning of Nixon's administration, and he had run on a campaign of getting out of Vietnam, perhaps trying to strike a populist chord, reacting to what had already been the buildup of this externally motivated anti-war movement. Were the failings and were a lot of the missteps really once that started and their attempts to pull out or not and not really having a clear idea of what was going to be coming next in theater?
Well, the biggest mistakes, I think, were made before Nixon. Biggest single mistake was in 1963 when the U.S. supports overthrow of the South Vietnamese president. That's when Kennedy is still alive. But then Johnson, when he comes in, commits a bunch of egregious errors, which include misleading the North Vietnamese about his intentions and claiming he's not going to fight, which then invites this North Vietnamese invasion. But in the Triumph for Gain, I look at once the Americans are on the ground in the fight, there are also some severe, big missed opportunities. And you have the military telling Johnson he's got to either attack the North more strongly or cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And Johnson consistently ignores them. And this then leads to this protracted war of attrition. And when you get to the 68 election, there is still strong sentiment for the war, which is actually why I think which helps Nixon get elected. But by the time Nixon's there, a lot of time has been lost.
When you look at America's involvement in Vietnam, people begin to point there and Korea, and then they start to extrapolate out into Afghanistan and more current history, and they start saying that the United States has shown that they don't go into these battles with a victory in their mind. I don't think that's true. I don't think of anyone who is a military commander does that. But is the United States starting to become guilty of fighting political wars with soldiers rather than just working on, trying to liberate people and give them the same opportunities that American citizens have, which was our mandate as we went into, World War II, certainly, but even in Gulf War, this was fighting tyranny and invasion and oppression, and America certainly has always been on the side of that.
Yes, well, you have this great divergence during the Johnson years between the military and some other hawks, and most notably President Eisenhower, who are saying we need to go in with decisive force. We don't want to let this war run on indefinitely. But they are opposed, on the other hand, by Robert McNamara, most significantly, Secretary of Defense, and then also who's able to convince Johnson for a long time. But McNamara looks to academic theories about conflict management, and those theories, by the way, are not based on history. They're based on abstract reasoning, and they prove to be fundamentally flawed because they don't really work in practice. But he's the one who keeps resisting these efforts at decisive blows because he's too concerned about how he might provoke the enemy, which most of the people who are more hard-headed and who have more experience are saying, well, that's nonsense, and you're actually provoking the enemy when you're being weak, and so and I'm afraid we may be confronting this problem again now that we're dealing with Ukraine, and we've got this what looks like a protracted war, and concern about who's provoking whom.
Mark Moyar is on with us. He's military historian at Hillsdale College and author of Triumph Regained, Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968. And I'm sorry, I was trying to scribble my notes. What was the book that preceded it? Triumph
Forsaken, yes, which is the Vietnam War from 1954 to 65. And although I said it also goes back further in history.
You brought up Ukraine just before we went to break. And I want to pick up there because there are a lot of folks who, sense, certainly we didn't have the media coverage that we do now as we started to send advisors and we started to send military aid into Vietnam prior to our direct military engagement there. Are there reasons to be concerned about this, given the fact that the Russian army has continued to show that they're capable of withstanding a long, protracted occupation?
Yes, I do think there's serious reasons to be concerned. There was, I think, initially hopes that the Russians would give in quickly, but that clearly hasn't happened. And so what triggers U.S. involvement in Vietnam is that South Vietnam in 1965 is on the verge of defeat, and it's only the U.S. basically faces the choice of either let your ally fall with all the negative repercussions that would go with that, or sending your troops in, and ultimately Johnson sends the troops in. And so I'm concerned we can get to a point where Kiev is on the verge of falling, or there's other indications that Ukraine's about to be overrun, and then we will face this choice of do we let this country that we've been supporting, do we just let them fall, or do which certainly it doesn't look it's damaging to your prestige and credibility to do that, but on the other hand, do we you want to commit American forces to fight Russians, which is also a deeply problematic outcome. So I think it's reason to try to avoid getting to the point where Ukraine is about to fall, which, I don't know that giving them weapons indefinitely is going to do that, because they have a much smaller population. So it may be necessary to come up with some kind of compromise that will give the Russians something, because I don't think the Russians will stop if they don't get anything ultimately.
Well, I know that just this week, Vladimir Putin, in his his version of the State of the Union address, announced that he would be pulling out of the SALT treaties, the strategic, the nuclear arms treaties with the United States, and that got a lot of people's attention because there's concerns that he would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I know that was somewhat of a fear in Vietnam as well, was that if it got too protracted, somebody would do that just to put an end to it all. Is that a concern? As a military historian, we really only have the one instance where truly militarily a nuclear weapon was deployed, two of them, are we still kind of wandering around in the dark, wondering what it would take for somebody to do something like that?
Yeah, in Vietnam, you never had Soviet combat forces in North Vietnam, or Chinese, although there were Chinese support troops, but there was a fear that China or the Soviets might intervene, and that McNamara often cited that, but turns out we've learned more from the other side. Those fears were misplaced. So there was never really a real possibility that American forces would be directly fighting the forces of a nuclear armed power. And, generally speaking, nuclear armed states have avoided fighting each other. So we would be, to some extent, going into uncharted territory if American and Russian forces are fighting each other directly. And I do think it would seriously increase the risk of some kind of nuclear confrontation, because neither side's probably going to use them right away, but if one country gets to the point of desperation, you never know, and people can be unpredictable and they can certainly do awful things.
When you talk about our involvement, and I want to go back to Vietnam, because again, you hear some of the same things out of Ukraine. Well, if Ukraine falls, then Poland's next, and I think there are military types who get right to the point where they're about to use the D word, domino, and they pull back from it. But did at very least the military and the president fumble the ball when it came to explaining what was going on and what the concern was, rather than just a domino effect, which almost became a punchline immediately, explaining what these puppet regimes would have created if all being run out of Moscow the way the rest of the Iron Curtain was?
Johnson did a particularly bad job of explaining the war. And for the most part, he just failed to do it. And he later admits that this was a mistake and that he did it because he was trying to spare his domestic agenda and maintain good relations with the Soviets. And at the same time, there is a real, I think, strong case to be made that the war is in America's interest, because there is, at that time, Chinese and communist expansionism across Asia is gaining a lot of momentum, and there's lots of indications from other countries in the region that they're going to bail out if the U.S. lets South Vietnam go. You didn't have an alliance that was on the order of magnitude of NATO. I think in the case of Ukraine, or for one thing, I think the threat of NATO and the strength of some of the NATO countries, and Poland especially, I think would discourage the Soviets from pushing farther. And the Russians, and the Russians view Ukraine as part of their sphere of interest. I'm not convinced that they would go farther. And also, Russia is no longer the great power it was. So I think it's a lot harder to claim that saving Ukraine is critical to our interests. I think it would certainly be damaging for Putin to succeed fully in what he's doing, but again, we have to balance that against what is in the realm of the possible.
Last one for you, Mark, and I really appreciate it. And people should pick up the book. I guess, Amazon has it. They can get it through hillsdale.edu as well.
Yes,
Nigel Farage, who's been on this program before and I hold in high esteem, has been very critical of our engagement in Ukraine. And in a little way, he points to Vietnam and that era, Korea as well, saying we sort of set up the Soviet Union to be this adversary that he didn't need to be, and that even after Putin came to power and tried to, put his country back together, we did the same thing to Putin and Russia, and that this is somehow our doing because we treated Russia as the Soviet Union, and we shouldn't have. We should, and therefore kind of isolated Putin. Is there any merit to that? I normally hold his opinion in high regard, but it was a very unusual take for him.
Yes, I don't think. I think that probably goes a bit too far. And I think Putin, the difference between Putin and Soviets is that the Soviets had an ideology that was, contagious, and it was affecting countries around the world, and turned China into a communist country. And 100 million people are killed by communism in the 20th century. Putin has some degree of he has an ideology, but it's not the kind of thing that is trying to be exported around the world, and it doesn't have the same appeal. And so I don't think that we've necessarily done much to contribute to what he's doing. But I do think Putin does view Ukraine as part of his essential sphere of interest, and I think we were clumsy in how we dealt with this, and I think the Biden administration was, at times talking about how we're going to do so much for Ukraine, but then they give the impression that, well, we're really not going to do much to help Ukraine, which entices Putin into invading, I think. And plus, you have this terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan, which sends signals of our weakness too. But again, similar in respects to Vietnam, in terms of we sent mixed signals to the enemy that were then that became pretext for an invasion.
I know I said that was the last one, but I watched way too much Columbo as a kid, and now, pardon me, I've got to. But your statement there really reminded me because there's been quite a bit made of. You mentioned, the South Vietnamese president in '63. A lot is being made that Vladimir Zelensky's election, from Moscow's view, was tainted because of the United States involvement in it, varying as to how far it went. Did we actually manipulate, what precincts were allowed to vote and that kind of thing? Or was it just they sent money to Zelensky's election? That kind of meddling in proxiness, is that continuing? And is that still something that America thinks we're going to get right eventually, only to find out that, the people we thought were our proxy friends turn out to be problems later on?
Yeah, so we don't have a very good record of judging who our allies are. Now, in the case of Vietnam in '63, there's a huge debate within the U.S. government over whether this ally is the right guy, and then the opponents prevail and they support this coup. It turns out to be a huge disaster because they underestimated the strengths of the guy we got rid of, and they thought there'd be all these great replacements who turned out not to be so great. Mm-hmm. And the media plays a large role in this. They did then, and now the Ukrainians have generally been getting great publicity from the Western press, but we're also starting to see more reports of serious corruption in Ukraine, which I think are causing people to question really what's going on. And I think we don't know. I don't think we have a good grip as to how effective this government really is, and which is especially important given how much money we are giving to them.
Is it really, and I absolutely promise this is the last one, because I've made the case that if talk radio had existed during the American Revolution, it would have been a nightmare. We would have been screaming for Washington's ouster, after Brandywine at very least. And we would, as a military historian, it's a thin piece of ice to cover a war because you're not seeing everything. And as a journalist, you need to, yes, report what you see, but also as our elected officials, we need to be making sure everyone understands the bigger picture, especially when von Steuben teaches Washington, you know what, you don't have to win, you just have to not lose. I think a modern press might have been like, this guy's just, Green is getting routed all the way down the James River and he's going to be in Yorktown before you know it, not realizing that was part of the tactic. Is that a danger in journalism as it comes to combating a military conflict, Mark? And then I promise I'll let you go for your weekend. Yes,
absolutely. It's that's a huge danger. And I caution people, if you look at what was written about Vietnam at the time, it's wrong in so many respects. So be very wary of anything you read in the press about what's going on in Ukraine.
Well, I appreciate it. Again, go to hillsdale.edu. As a matter of fact, send your kids, send your grandkids, send your neighbors' kids to Hillsdale because, as Khrushchev said during the time, we're in your schools already. So I wonder if the communist invasion didn't happen without tanks or anything else and came in the way of books and ideology, Mark. And I guess that's a bigger question and a bigger time. But to hillsdale.edu, Amazon.com, it's Triumph Regained and Triumph Forsaken. Please pick up both books. Get them if you have friends, family members from the Vietnam era. If you are, take a look into it. It's a refreshing guide. And thank you for spending this much time with us over the weekend.
Great. Thanks very much.
Coming up next, we visit with Melanie Collette, president of American Commitment on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.